And there we have it. So that is the voice of Sharon Bauer reminding us that we just cannot turn a blind eye. We cannot keep walking away. It's a big thank you to Sharon Bauer, but a big thank you, of course, to Lila Kabarsi for an excellent moderation of the conversation. And of course, to Guy Ryder, the Director General of the ILO, for kicking off that very important discussion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in case you've missed it, just to quickly highlight how can you get involved and how can you make sure that your business is part of the solution? And two of the things that came out of that conversation was the Think Lab on just transition. And this really is a mechanism to help the private sector or enable the private sector to support the UN Secretary General's vision. And this is caused by the UNGC hosting the Think Lab on just transition. The Think Lab is really about simplifying the rationale of what it means for your business's strategy to support and engage in a just transition. We also, of course, heard a lot in the conversation about business ambition for 1.5 degrees. And of course, in line with that, we heard there's no time to dawdle. We really need to accelerate action. And so an opportunity for you to step up and commit your business to science-based targets that are aligned with limiting global temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. A third way in which you can get involved is by exploring the resource library, including, of course, finally connecting and communicating with our leaders in the space and really sharing some of the lessons learned and sharing some of the best practice in your different areas. As always, a QR code will come up on your chat and in your screen should you want to read more. Now, again, we are moving on swiftly to our very next engagement and conversation. In this next conversation, we're really going to be looking at the role of business in reducing inequalities and advancing human rights. And before we turn to our speakers, the moderator of this conversation is Jin Kyung Kang. She's the president and dean of the Asian Institute of Management, and she'll be taking up the lead as a moderator of this conversation, and will be introducing her panelists and guiding us through. But before we do that, allow me to turn our attention to remarks from Madame Anita Bhatia, the Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director at UN Women, to share her remarks.
Dear colleagues and participants, I am pleased to share a few reflections on behalf of UN Women for the 2022 UN Global Compact Summit. We are all joining today to identify how we can jointly address the many and complex challenges that remain for achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. In the last few years, we have witnessed some serious setbacks. Increasing levels of poverty and inequality are taking us further away from achieving the SDGs by 2030. It contributes to increased challenges for women in accessing employment and decent work, in accessing finance, in accessing the digital economy, and it leads to increased violence against women and girls. If the past 2 years have taught us something, it is that global challenges such as this require global multi-stakeholder collaboration. Business has a particularly powerful and important role to play in protecting human rights and in fostering equality. Today, I would like to propose 2 concrete avenues for collaboration. First, I'd like to encourage all businesses to adopt the Women's Empowerment Principles, or WEPs. These have already been signed by 6,500 business leaders in more than 150 countries. They offer a blueprint for action in 7 strategic areas, including some of the topics being addressed today. The widespread adoption of these principles is a testimony to business leaders' understanding that gender equality is good for business and that slow or limited action has serious costs for their organizations. I would also like to encourage investment in businesses that adopt the WEPs and promote gender equality. We know that investors are increasingly incorporating in assessments of companies' status on gender equality to determine how they might respond to ESG risks and opportunities. And we know that increasingly smart business leaders take gender equality and human rights considerations into account and report on progress and results. Working together in partnership, we can make a difference. I wish you a successful and innovative, exciting, and path-breaking summit. Thank you.
Welcome everyone to this session on reducing inequalities to advance human rights, the role of business in achieving that goal. We have a fantastic panel for you today. Very little time to hear their insights, so we'll jump right in with the discussion. But just before a quick round for our panel, we have John Abrahamson Ring, CEO of Inter IKEA Group. We have Alexandra Pal, Chief Corporate Responsibility Officer at L'Oréal, as well as Nicolette Naylor, International Program Director for Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Justice at the Ford Foundation. Welcome to the three of you. John, we'll go with you first. We'll ask you the first question, so you have the honor of kicking this session. So here it comes. Increasingly, companies are understanding the connections between the widening inequalities we see today, both in their operations and supply chains. How do you at IKEA see your role in terms of addressing inequality?
First of all, I'm very happy and honored to be here with you today and talk about this very important topic, and also demonstrating how important it is for us, together with my co-panelist here, for the business to be part of the solution for a more equal society. We all know that in the situation we're in right now, with the aftermaths and in the continuation of the pandemic, we have the climate change challenge, we have geopolitical tensions across the globe. What we clearly see is that inequality is increasing at this moment. IKEA's vision is to create a better everyday life for the many. This has been a very good business mission and vision, but it's equally important social mission. And we do this by staying very focused and providing home furnishing products for as many people as possible so that they can afford it. In doing this, we are touching millions of people across the whole value chain of IKEA, and we have an impact on all of them. We have, of course, our 200,000 plus co-workers that we have to work with and improve their situation. We have our whole value chain, our whole supply chain, where there is close to 800,000 people working every day making IKEA products and solutions that we also have to work with and help and improve. And of course, we have our 400 million plus customers that we also want to enable and improve their situation for. And of course, all partners and collaborations and colleagues like yourself as well. So this is a big undertaking, and we have to contribute to a positive change. We want and we need to grow our business. We want to help even more of the many to a better life at home. And we need to do this in a way so that all people, everyone that is impacted throughout our whole value chain, that we can help them and thrive and provide a good life for themselves and their families. We have a long-standing commitment to respecting human rights and have been working to develop our human rights due diligence approach in line with UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And we have a specific focus on children. And I'm very proud that this year, children's rights and business principles we have at IKEA, they are celebrating. We have done that now for 10 years. These principles has played a fundamental role for our agenda and our business in all aspects.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I do apologize to everybody that I am a little bit late because I was very early and then everything went wrong and my camera, my microphone, nothing worked. So I caught most of Jan's response. It's really, really good to hear that you're doing amazing things at IKEA that are really making a difference. So thank you very much for their response. So my next question is to Nicolette Mayer at Ford Foundation. We know that companies often address these inequality issues through many different kinds of programs, whether it's raising awareness or providing training programs. Yet, there are many studies that show these approaches alone are often not very effective in bringing about the real change that we would like to see. So, what would be your advice for corporate leaders in order for us to have a greater impact in tackling more structural issues such as gender and racial inequalities?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. I'm really pleased to be on such an esteemed panel. This is a great question as well, because I think the first point I would make is that leadership matters. And leadership at the highest level matters in terms of not only increasing diversity in management and leadership roles in terms of race, gender, disability, sexual orientation. Those are all important because that sets the tone and it's really a value statement by the institution. And then also what these leaders say and do and message when it comes to issues of discrimination is equally important and critical, because leaders can prioritize or dismiss the importance of these issues, and they signal a type of culture then around what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. But I'm also going to add a but here, and it's quite a big but, because I think messaging by leadership is not sufficient. It still needs to be followed up with firm policies and programs that are monitored and implemented in a way that holds individuals and institutions accountable. I think training programs and awareness raising is just one aspect. It's again not enough. And as everyone embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's important that we recognize that hiring a few Black women leaders within a large global organization doesn't shift deeply embedded racist and patriarchal attitudes overnight. It doesn't shift culture. And that's what we've learned at the Ford Foundation. I think having people like myself, people like our president, Darren Walker, in leadership roles in the global institution is important, but it doesn't actually shift culture. One needs to do more. So let me say a few things about culture and shifting culture, because I think culture requires us to move from progressive policies on paper to practice. And a good starting point is to not deny that discrimination and prejudice can and does exist within our own organizations. I think we often have a tendency to focus on bad apples and individuals within our institutions without recognizing the structural and systemic issues. Our organizations are microcosms of society. And so if racism is playing outside in society, it's playing out within our own organizations. And I think starting by accepting that this is happening within our organizations allows us to have a transformation conversation and a transforming culture conversation where we actually interrogate our institutional history, our privilege, and our power alongside our mission and values. So we go beyond the numbers game and saying the fact that we have staff that are Black or Indigenous or women or disabled is not enough, because that's not shifting our values and a long-standing organizational culture that's embracing a male standard or a white male heteronormative value system is what we actually need to address. I think the next thing we need to think about is Are we expecting people to assimilate where people of color, of African descent, only succeed within global organizations where they are actually assimilating into the mainstream culture of the institution? And how culturally competent are our staff? Are we doing exercises in cultural humility where we identify our own biases and acknowledging our biases? And so I think to end off this question, I think we have to open up a question around belonging and cultures of insiders and outsiders within our institution, and move beyond the numbers game to really unpacking how we're doing. This may require us to actually do race and gender audits of our external stakeholders, which is what we've done in the Ford Foundation, and our staff, to find out how people experience us. How do Black women experience the institution as staff, and how do our external partners experience the institution? And then start to think about, what does belonging look like? What does belonging feel like in the culture of our institution? And then the last thing we've done is to expand the way we think about safe working environments. Often, I think we as leaders, COVID has taught us that we have to think about what makes a workplace safe and accessible and inclusive. And I think COVID has taught us that it's about flexible work time, it's about flexibility around where we expect staff to work, the times they work, the hours they work. It's about equitable pay, and it's about accessible and inclusive cultures that we facilitate, and where we're having hard conversations, difficult conversations about what isn't working, what is working, where we're constantly introspecting on our own cultures and shying away from a superficial numbers game, or a game where we're just denying that issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion are actually really, really hard within our institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolette. You know, I've worked and lived 2/3 of my life as some sort of minority, ever since I left Korea. So I relate so much of what you said, Nicolette, in terms of, oftentimes we really need to have transformation of culture. And to a degree, it has to be top down, whether we're talking about policy changes, how we set up accountability. But I also am grateful that you brought in the topic of belonging, because I think for a while we've been talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. But I know for a fact, just because we're hitting the right notes on those three, it doesn't necessarily mean that, all those people who don't feel that there exists some sort of equity feel they actually belong to the workplace, belong to any group. So I think that's a really important concept that we need to address. Thank you very much for that. My next question, I'm going to go back to John. We understand that you are strengthening the social chapter of your sustainability strategy. Would you please share with us some examples of priorities you see going forward, and how this responds to the increased pressure related to mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, the latest legislation being the proposal by EU Commission to enact a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation?
Yes, thank you for that question. First, let me start with your final part there then. We are firm believers and full supporters of an EU legislation on mandatory human rights due diligence. We think that good regulations, international regulations that we can all adhere and use, that helps us be sharp. It helps us identify where the problems are and what the impact we need to focus on. But it also levels the playing field. So we are very much for international standards, legislations, and how we can, as a total world community, can benefit from that. So that's one thing. Then you're right. We are going forward. Our ambition in this topic are very big and important, and we have them as big parts of our direction, strategies in all our business agendas. But if I should focus on three things that are top of my mind at this moment, one is in the transition that we need to be part of and contribute to net zero circular economy where people can have great home furnishing, but there is not a negative impact on the climate and all these challenges we see. We need to make that transition in as just way as possible. This transition cannot be for the few and by. This has to be for the many, affordable for the many, accessible for the many, and with the many. And I think that is something that we are thinking a lot about. How do we transform into more sustainable materials, more smarter innovations where we get more from less, circular, but at the same time also look at all the people that are impacted by IKEA and how we bring as many as possible of them with us in this. That's one question. The second is that we are committed to provide living wages and income to our co-workers, our sort of immediate co-worker group, but also through cooperation and influence and working with our many partners across the whole supply chain. And then lastly, also important, and building on also on what Nicoletta talked to, and you also referred to here, is of course we have a big responsibility. We have 400 million customers. We know that it's 1 billion people that benefits from an IKEA product every year in homes. We need to make those products even more inclusive. We need to make sure we want our places, kitchen, wardrobes to be inclusive so that even more can use them, even more feel that they are relevant, even more appreciate and can improve their homes as well. And there we have a way to go. We are most relevant for Europe because that's where many of us come from, but across the globe, this is a great opportunity for us.
Thank you very much, Jan. I think, many years ago, we used to think that all this rhetoric we used to call on the sustainability, whether it's inequality, improvement, really didn't connect to the company's bottom line. But I think as more and more companies actually practice this and have a better understanding of their own operations as well as supply chain, if you will, I think we have a more and more evidences to show that not only these programs are making social impact, but actually it helps the companies too, right? So I'm glad to hear some of your examples in terms of what's happening at IKEA. Okay, so now I want to turn to Alexandra Pault from L'Oreal. So the French Corporate Duty of Vigilance law adopted in 2017, I believe, requires large companies in France to identify and prevent risks to human rights and the environment involved with their supply chains. The law, in very short, requires the companies to create and implement a publicly available vigilance plans for which they can be held accountable. And L'Oreal has been operating with a legal framework when it comes to addressing human rights risk. What is your take on current discussions related to the proposed EU directive on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation? How did the French law impact L'Oreal's commitment to address human rights risks?
Yeah, so hello and thank you for having us. We're very happy and pleased to be able to contribute to this session from our side. So I think what is important, I would just like to build on what you just said, is that actually I think it is when you talk about bottom line, we really have to ask the question the other way around now. It's not anymore about why is sustainability and all related social and environmental issues so important for companies and how much do they cost and so on. The question is really the other way around. What happens if we don't do it? And if we don't do it, we are not going to stay in business. And I think because business can only operate in peaceful societies that are resilient, where we have neither environmental nor social catastrophes every day. And so I think the question now, I'm really very often I tell that journalists or interviewers in conferences, please don't ask a question anymore like this on what is the added value. Ask what is the question of inaction. And I think we have to be very clear about that. And that is a language that has to change because it takes too much time. I think what we are hearing, I have also listened to the session before, it's very clear businesses, a lot of businesses have realized that their work needs to be done. Now, the question is, how fast are we going to do that work? Because we are running out of time. We are running out of time on environmental issues. We are running out of time on fighting climate change, fighting biodiversity loss, and giving an income to people that allows them to survive decently with their dependents. And so I think all these issues are related. And as we are running out of time, we have to accelerate. And so there are different tools that allow to accelerate. There is leadership. I think Nicolette had a very fair point on leadership. I do believe in that leadership in the 21st century is going to be essential in a more and more VUCA, never have seen crisis world. Leadership and the personality of the leader and its capacity to be courageous, innovative, resilient, responsible is something that is completely different from the leadership of the 20th century. So yes, we need leaders. One tool is leadership. Another tool is, of course, consumer pressure, stakeholder pressure. Another tool is law. So as John, I'm very much in favor of a European legislation because I do think, well, I'm a lawyer by training, so I do believe that law is a tool that can regulate behavior and that can lead to social change. And we have seen that in the past. It's not going to be the only tool, but it definitely has to be one tool. Law has to be a tool that makes it clear for those who are not committed, for those who do not see the added value, for those who do not understand the world we are living in, that they do not have any choice. So France is a country where you put laws on everything and everywhere. So that's normal that we have been the first country to bring such a law in. And I think it is interesting because for a company like L'Oreal, we have been committed for quite a long time. Our first social audits go back to before 2000. So we were in that move. And so actually, for me, it was almost a little bit too slow because, when you look how deep it is going in the value chain, my stake is to go much deeper into the value chain than does the law, because the law is stopping at level 1 for the moment. And so I do not think that this is sufficient. But for companies who are not committed, I think it's a powerful tool. And it is a power tool for stakeholders and for NGOs because a lot of complaints were filed against companies where the NGOs thought they did not take into account sufficiently, especially environmental issues, because a lot of companies thought that this was just the post-Rana Plaza law and not necessary to take into account any other issues. So law is a tool. It's not going to be the only tool. No law, no stakeholder pressure, nothing, unfortunately, we will need a renewed leadership in politics, economies, in NGOs to make it clear that the essential point now is not everybody has understood that we have to move, but has everybody understood we have to accelerate the movement? I'm not sure about that.
Thank you very much for that. Because we're running out of time, but I want to ask one additional question because I couldn't agree more that we really need to work together, with the legislation, by the government, the companies, NGOs. I think everybody needs to work together. It's not something that can be done by one party. But I want to ask you as a follow-up question, the issue of low wages is increasingly integrated within the scope of business as human rights risk analysis. how do you assess the potential impact of accelerating living wages agenda through private sector on achieving decent work for all? If you can try to answer it within a minute or so, that would be great.
Yeah,
So
right.
I'd like to go back to Nicolette for one more question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I do think that this is an issue that perfectly demonstrates what you just said about cooperation. So we have applied living wage standards to our own employees, of course, because I think there is also something about coherence and consistency. Before engaging your suppliers and other companies, you have to try to be exemplary and do the job at home. So we have done that. Now, of course, it is more of a challenge to bring in the whole value chain, the whole supply chain. And so we will be able to make that change together with our competitors, distributors, suppliers. So we are in the moment working on pilots in order to show also to our suppliers that there are ways, business wages does not mean that you will lose money automatically. It can mean you have a lot of stakes that will allow you to have, if you have a more just society, you have a more sustainable society, and then you have a better business operating environment. And so we are working with our suppliers and other companies in pilots now. And I think the living wage issue, there are a few. Nobody wants to be alone facing climate change, biodiversity loss, living wage. We want to be many to address these issues, and everybody has to understand that. We cannot anymore, we don't have the luxury anymore looking at organizations saying, oh, that are the bad guys, that are the companies, or that are the good guys. Now, every person and every company, every actor, every association that wants to move is a valuable partner with whom we want to move, because the stakes are so high, the urgency is so important. We have to move together.
Great. Thank you very much for that wonderful response. So our last question is back to Nicolette. I think not just this panel, but we all agree that tackling human rights and inequality issues requires active, meaningful partnerships between all stakeholders, right? And I think it's been mentioned by our speakers as well. In your work at the Ford Foundation, what opportunities or examples have you seen for effective management between for-profit enterprises and civil society to tackle inequality issues? If you can share with us some examples, maybe one or two, very briefly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So what we've realized at the Ford Foundation, we are a social justice foundation that spends approximately $500 million per year supporting social justice causes around the world to address inequality. Our North Star is inequality. So we work on issues of climate change, natural resource governance, gender and racial justice, the future of work, all the hard structural issues. And we know that no matter how much resources we have, the philanthropy community and the Ford Foundation can never solve the problem of inequality on our own. And so we are prioritizing more coordination and collaboration between philanthropy, governments, bilateral, multilateral agencies, and the private sector. Because I think COVID has taught us that we have to redefine our relationships with governments and the private sector and international bodies if we really want to solve big global problems. So 2 examples. We see these partnerships often as a way to reach scale and sustainable action. So we've worked with the UN, some member states, and the private sector on the issues of gender equality and the women's rights agenda, particularly around gender-based violence, which we see as an issue that's quite ripe to take an all-of-society approach. It's not a woman's problem. It's not a foundation's problem. The private sector needs to engage with it. And we've seen the economic costs of gender-based violence on economies. Where I come from in South Africa, this is called for a whole of society approach where we've brought together the private sector, large Johannesburg Stock Exchange companies, together with government, the feminist movement, philanthropy partners, to fund the implementation of a GBV plan and a response fund to respond to high rates of gender-based violence in the country and high rates of femicide in the country. And I think that's a meaningful way of bringing people together to get to scale and also involve government. So where one could then leverage your resources and the amount of money you're putting into an issue like gender-based violence, but also get government to put money in and the private sector and bring the women's rights movement into the equation. And there we've also worked with the multilateral partners like UN Women. We recently applied this model to the care economy because we see that care connects all of us. And in this moment of crisis, we have to redefine care globally. But Ford can't redefine care on our own. So we've partnered with the World Bank on a global childcare incentive fund that's going to catalyze $180 million in new money over the next 5 years to support childcare in low and middle income countries and implement better childcare programs and policies and give us some evidence on the impacts of childcare on women's economic empowerment, early childhood development, and inclusive economic growth. Bringing together some of the gender sector work, the children's rights sector work, and the inclusive economy sector work in this kind of whole of society approach. And there we're partnering with governments of Australia, the United States, Canada, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Lego Foundation, the Conrad Hilton Foundation, and the Ford Foundation, coming together to pool our resources to tackle a global problem and produce some evidence around what's working and what's not working for others. And I think this model, I really agree what the Alexandra was saying. In this moment of crisis, it can't be about good guys and bad guys. We have to find champions within the private sector, within governments, no matter how hard that is, and start working together. The world is polarized enough as it is, and it's not helping us to solve intractable inequality issues that we need to solve. And so all of us have to start being prepared to leave our logos at the door and work together to come up with solutions that work for the whole of society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Indeed, inequality is a really systematic, pervasive risk that undermines our human dignity and social process around the world. It's not just in one country, one geographic region. Inequalities are on the rise, unfortunately, driving instability and also widening the divides that push vulnerable groups into even more difficult situations. So I'm so pleased to hear and see that progress has been made. And it's not going to be just unique examples that we hear about, but in more and more leadership coming from businesses as well as other sectors are all working together in partnership that is going to make a difference in terms of creating social impact. So thank you very much for joining us on your busy schedule, John, Alexandra, Nicolette. Thank you again. Have a great afternoon or evening wherever you are. Bye-bye.